Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into part 2 of the Siege of Vienna. If you did not see part 1 of this new reaction series, there's a link in the description that will take you back to that first episode from yesterday, as well as link to the original content if you want to see it without my commentary. Also, if you haven't already had a chance, if you're into podcasts, I did start a new podcast. Episode 3 of the Vlogging Through History podcast is now live. It's about the story of the Lost Battalion from World War I. The first 3 episodes are all stories from World War I. We're going to be diving into a completely different topic once I get into part 4, which should be out in about a week or so. So 3 episodes live. There's links in the description to where you can find those on Spotify and iTunes. There are other places that you can find the podcast besides just those 2. Those are just the links that I have available to me right off the top of my head that I could throw in there for you. So check it out wherever you enjoy podcasts. Let's go ahead and dive into part 2 of the Siege of Vienna.
July 25th, Vienna. The Ottoman engineers work in the dark, chipping away at the stony soil with pickaxes and judging distance with twine. 20 feet above, at surface level, other engineers are creating trench works, throwing boards on top for a roof, and heaping them with earth so that the soldiers can approach the enemy defenses under cover. They're also setting up sandbag positions for the artillery. But down here, there's only cold earth and the toneless music of tools on stone.
So it's fascinating to think about that even in the 17th century, the process of reducing the enemy, which is kind of a term that's used when dealing with with laying siege to someone, is that you want to reduce the enemy's ability to defend. And it's a complicated process. It's not just park around your enemy and starve him out. It's not just pound away with artillery and knock his walls down. It's much more complicated than that. It's preparing these mines underneath so that you can blow holes in the defenses so that your army can go through. It's preparing the way in which your army is going to go through. There's so much complication to all of this.
When the men emerge to rest, the sun makes them squint. Finally, their officer measures the distance and nods, directly beneath the enemy. The men pile bags of gunpowder at the end of a tunnel and lay a long fuse. An engineer then touches a candle to the fuse, blows on it, and waits patiently. Once it glows, he begins to run. The first day of the siege, Vienna panicked. A teenage boy dressed in women's clothing, possibly an actor or a saboteur in disguise, threw burning wood and straw into the city's arsenal. The door of the powder storage caught fire, though soldiers extinguished it before the whole arsenal went
sabotage.
up. The arsonist barely made it around the block before a crowd of citizens tore him apart with their bare hands. The mob was so consumed with fear, they didn't even consider his value as a prisoner. They'd heard what happened in fortress towns outside Vienna. When they resisted, Ottoman troops had beheaded the leading citizens and pressed the rest into slavery. Vienna had received the same offer from Kara Mustafa. Surrender and live in peace as Muslims or Christians, or resist and condemn yourself to death and slavery.
And, this is not unique to this Muslim army. This was standard practice when you had to lay siege. If the town you were besieging resisted, when you finally took the town, the results were catastrophic for the people who resisted. And the whole point of that was to cause the next town to think twice before resisting, because they can save themselves if they give up peacefully, but if they decide to resist and you lose, then you all die.
The city's commander, Stachenberg, chose resistance. But those initial days of panic were done, and now the siege was grueling, bloody routine. The engineer Georges Rimpler had finished his earthworks. The city already had an old medieval wall studded with defensive towers, and earlier, the defenders had planted triangular fortress islands, revlins, into the dry moat that channeled attackers into overlapping fields of fire.
And this is another common strategy that you see all the way up through the 20th century is you can't defend the entire field. So the way that you reduce the disadvantage you have in terms of numbers and ability to cover everything is you funnel the attackers into lanes where you can destroy them easily. Same thing happens, for example, in World War I, where if the enemy blows holes in your barbed wire, well, hey, that's fine. The barbed wire was there to stop them, but by having holes through the barbed wire, now all the machine guns can concentrate on those holes because everybody's got to funnel through them. At the Battle of Passchendaele up in Ypres, they had to lay boards across because of all the mud that was everywhere. And so those boards, the defenders knew that was where they were going to come from. So all you had to do was focus on that one little area. You didn't have to cover the whole field.
Rimpler had augmented this by building an earthen rampart at the top of the slope leading up to the steep moat, studding it with blockhouses and bunkers that had to be taken one by one. And in front of those fortifications, he built a spiked palisade. Now, enemies had to take multiple layers of defenses, and those tunneling toward the city would emerge in the moat with musket fire pouring down on them from front and behind. Rimpler had also strengthened the Revlins with extra defenses, and dug trenches between all of the earthworks so defenders could reinforce positions under assault.
Brilliant.
The heaviest defenses, though, were in front of the palace. Rimpler knew that that's where the Ottomans would hit them. It was the longest stretch of wall without a tower, and it was flat and dry for easy digging.
So, I get that reference right away. Bugs Bunny, if you're old enough like me to have grown up with Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny was always digging, and there was always this joke about him taking the wrong turn at Albuquerque.
And Rimpler was right. The moment Kara Mustafa arrived, he set up his command tent directly across from the palace, while his troops surrounded the city. Charles of Lorraine across the river couldn't stop him. And within days, Mustafa was testing Rimpler's defenses. Trenches zigzagged forward towards the Habsburg capital. But despite Kara Mustafa's vast advantage in numbers, he had problems. The majority of his forces were levies, not professional soldiers. And sure, they're useful for surrounding a city, but not so great in an assault. The Tartar horsemen were barely under his control, and they scoured the countryside. Bad roads made him leave his heaviest cannons and mortars behind, and the gunpowder sent from the frontier territories was poor. In fact, when it rained, he couldn't fire his cannons, and it rained a lot. Through the first week of the siege, the Ottomans...
That's one thing. The best planning you can make, the best organization you can have for your army being well supplied, being well led, none of that can help with things like weather. And boy, weather has decided more major campaigns. I mean, everybody talks about the great English victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. That came down to weather. Weather decided that. Look at the times that Japan was saved because of weather. When there was an enemy fleet that was trying to attack their homeland. Weather is one of those factors you just can't account for.
Pushed forward toward the defenses inch by inch, digging trenches, gathering forces, and unleashing waves of janissaries on night raids to hit the palisade. In this battle between trench and blockhouse, with soldiers mere feet from each other, the primary weapon was not sword or musket, but instead the grenade. Squads lit these bombs from braziers and slowly marched, hurling handheld, faulty explosives at each other. Ottoman grenades were cased in glass and clay. They were lighter and killed by sheer explosive blast, but the Habsburg grenades were iron, and though heavy and short-ranged, caused hideous shrapnel wounds. The toll was heavy.
It's interesting that people think grenades a modern invention. Grenades have been around for a long time. Grenades were used here. They were used in the American Civil War. They were not, a 20th century thing, though. I think for a lot of my own life growing up as a kid studying history, I thought grenades were something that came about in World War II. I had no idea that they existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years before that.
But Stauffenberg refused a truce to collect the fallen. So as they advanced, inch by inch, Ottoman soldiers had to march past their dead comrades from previous attacks. And to top it all off, winter was coming. That's what had doomed Suleiman when he tried to take the city back in 1529. The bitter cold. The Grand Vizier swore history would not repeat itself, because soon his mining tunnels would be ready. July 25th, the Palisade. Night was falling on the defenses as Rimpler inspected his works. He was concerned. The day before, the Ottomans had detonated 2 mines at the end of the line, then tried to storm the broken palisade. Both assaults had failed, but they would only keep coming. And inside the city, Stauffenberg had citizens listening in their cellars. Rumors said Turks were infiltrating through the sewers. And during Mass that morning, a cannonball had smashed into St. Stephen's Cathedral and struck the organ. But
Not
here,
the organ.
on the line, things still looked pretty solid. Then, the Earth leapt upward. Rimpler saw sky and Earth intermingle, and he crashed down the wrong way. Stones rained down. He tried to wipe the dirt from his eyes and found his arm wouldn't respond. It was shot through with splinters from the shattered palisade. Screams rang out. Men scattered. Janissaries surged up the loose ramp of broken earth toward the gap in the defenses, swinging blades and hurling bombs. Garrison soldiers flooded the ruined gap, firing muskets and rolling grenades downhill. One of Rimpler's engineers grabbed him and dragged him backward over the splintered, studded earth to relative safety. The line was holding. That attack would set the pattern for the next week and a half. An Ottoman mine would explode, attackers would surge into the gap, and defenders would sally from their trenches and blockhouses to drive them back. The Ottomans advanced, but the earthworks were slowing them. His defenses were working. But Rimpler wouldn't live to see it. He died in one of the city's makeshift hospitals. The man who had done the most to defend Vienna would receive none of the credit. Yet by that time, Vienna's garrison were trying a new tactic: countermining. They dug their own tunnels.
And this is one of the most fascinating aspects of warfare is mining and countermining. And there's actually just a movie that came out not too long ago about the mining and countermining operations that went on during World War I, because there's such strategy to it. And when I visited Vauquois Hill on the World War I Western Front, there are these, like, you can stand where the German mines started, and then within a couple of minutes walk over to where the French mines started. And they were actually, like, they would occasionally break through, and there would be hand-to-hand combat underground when these mines broke through to each other. And there were all these listening posts where everything would have to be dead quiet so they could try and hear where things were coming from. But a lot of times, sound travels differently underground, and so it doesn't necessarily work the way you think it does. And when I was in Vicksburg, I talked about the mining that was going on there, and the Confederates were digging counter mine shafts going down because they knew that the Union was digging mines under their positions, but they couldn't find them, even though they were digging all these mine shafts.
Worming toward the Ottoman lines. Sometimes they sallied out into the enemy works, burning trench supports to destroy routes towards the city. And on occasion, they detonated a mine beneath Ottoman defenses, disintegrating the earthworks the enemies had raised to fire down on the defenders. Then, there was the most confused up-close fighting, when two teams of miners intercepted each other underground. Now, that was terrifying.
Yeah.
Earth would crumble away, revealing an enemy so close you could see candlelight reflecting in his eyes. At such times, the tunnels descended into shuffling melee, with miners swinging pickaxes, then retreating before the ceilings collapsed in on friend and foe alike.
Oh, man.
And when they could, they sealed enemy tunnels with grenades or powder barrels. Meanwhile, inside the city, things were deteriorating. During the beginning of the siege, Viennese citizens slipped the lines to trade food with the Ottomans. But Starhemberg stopped that, worrying that it was an avenue for spies. So apart from a few cattle raids by the university students, he effectively locked the citizens of Vienna inside. And despite his leadership, the citizens began losing their grip as food ran low. They ate household pets, with some sardonic wit renaming cats roof rabbits.
Roof rabbits. But this is what happens, right? I mean, this is kind of part of what you count on is the siege eventually wearing down the enemy when he starts running out of supplies, and especially when he's got civilians, because the military can hold out probably longer than civilians can. When moms start seeing their children starving, when families start eating their pets, there's a psychological aspect to that too, and they're going to start putting pressure on their own military to surrender, to give up the city. We can't hold out any longer. Of course, they don't maybe understand, as a lot of other people do, that it probably means their own deaths anyway. So, it starts to become a psychological thing, and you start to feel and see and experience things in a different way when you're hungry, when you're starving, when you have fear.
I'm with you, Zoe. That's messed up. Overcrowded and lacking sanitation, flux and dysentery chewed at the garrison. As August dragged into September, the Ottomans blew through the palisade and made a ramp up the first Revlin, and the apocalyptic panic from the earlier days of the siege returned. When the defenders took Ottoman prisoners, they decapitated and filleted them, sometimes alive, and hung their skins on the city wall. Then, on September 4th, the unthinkable happened. A roar from underground. 30 feet of medieval wall, right next to the bastion, bowed up, then collapsed. Through the gap, the shell-shocked defenders saw the Ottoman banners. Turkish batteries set up on the fallen defenses hammered the gap. Janissaries breached the wall. Musketeers sprinted in, trying to hold. They built a barricade of sandbags and cotton bales. Engineers, having anticipated a breach, rolled a spiked obstacle in front. And they had been lucky. The mine had detonated during a changing of the guard. Therefore, the previous shift and the fresh soldiers, both uninjured in the blast, loosed fire down the slope, shooting blind into gunpowder smoke. Ottoman troops, sensing an end to this...
That's one of those things, right, that sometimes history is determined by matter of minutes. The Battle of Midway was determined by a matter of minutes because of exactly when things happened. If they had happened a few minutes earlier or a few minutes later, it would have been a completely different outcome, or so we think. Right here, if this hadn't happened exactly when the changing of the guard happens, does it have a different outcome? Well, maybe, maybe not, but we don't know. But so much of history comes down to these moments like this.
Hellish siege sallied from tunnels and trenches to rush the gap. They focused fire on the defenders in the gap and nearby bastion, trying to keep their heads down as their comrades tried to break through. For 2 hours, the Ottomans pushed, and for 2 hours, the Viennese held. When the smoke cleared, 200 defenders were dead, and the breach littered with Ottoman casualties. Vienna still resisted, but it was clear that the city was days, if not hours, from falling. And 3 days later, a mine took down the other end of the wall. Another desperate defense. In the distance, they could see 5 more tunnels burrowing toward them. Kara Mustafa was preparing for a general assault, and Stauffenberg only had 4,000 men left. He began fortifying the city, ready to fight for Vienna, street by street. But while doing so, Stauffenberg was sending letters through the line, out to Lorraine and Leopold's court. They said a relief force was coming. They'd said it for weeks. So where the heck were they? And could they make it in time?
We know what happens next if you're a Sabaton fan, but we'll get to that in tomorrow's episode. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. If there's something that you want to add to what was going on in this part that we can all learn from, let's learn together. Let me know something you learned that maybe you didn't know about in today's episode. And like I said, if you're into podcasts, please use the links below or use whatever podcast service that you use. Check out the Vlogging Through History podcast. Now 3 episodes live. And if you would, review that for me as well. That'll help a lot. Thanks for watching.